So tell me, Alex, what happened? What kind of announcements did we get at the Worldwide Developers Conference, and what's going on at Apple?
The Worldwide Developers Conference, known as DubDub internally, WWDC, is the annual big announcement of Apple's software projects over the next year. And at this one, well, if you're an iPhone user, the big obvious thing hitting your phone in autumn will be liquid glass, the new design aesthetic. Your phone will look new for the first time since iOS 7 over a decade ago. But behind the scenes, the more important stuff is this is Apple's second year playing catch up to the AI industry, and it's not going so well.
Alex, as I'm sitting here on my Mac talking to you with my phone, my iPhone next to me, it seems like Apple's doing just fine. So what's going wrong?
Apple is doing just fine. It's still the second largest company in the world. It prints money through the innovative business plan of making expensive things that it sells to consumers for cash. Wild in these days of ad-supported media and harvesting data for profit. But the problem is there's trouble on the horizon, right? The company's AI efforts are floundering, its factories are being tariffed, regulators worldwide are turning against it, even in its home state of California. It's just snatched a defeat from the jaws of victory in a court case against Epic Games, the developer of Fortnite, which had tried to push for Apple to open up the App Store to allow rival developers to run their own services on Apple's platform. Apple actually had won 8 of the 9 counts in that court case, and the only one it lost was a provision about whether or not it could control the communication of developers to their users. But it skirted the compliance that the court had set so badly and pissed off the judge so much that it's been hit with an incredibly punitive injunction, effectively preventing it from having any say on how developers communicate with their users, which in effect means that Apple can no longer guarantee that it collects the up to 30% tax it puts on any payments made through the App Store. The App Store is worth $1.3 trillion to the global economy, according to Apple's own figures, which are obviously inflated to make the company's $30 billion that it takes in fees and payments seem paltry by comparison. But, that's a $30 billion annual run rate that is at jeopardy thanks to this court ruling.
That's quite a laundry list of problems. Let's start with the first one you mentioned. You said Apple's AI is floundering. What do you mean by that?
The company made a big deal about coming to AI fairly late, even this time last year. It branded it as Apple Intelligence and announced a raft of new AI-powered features coming specifically to iPhones. But what happened in the following year is that a good chunk of those features simply didn't arrive in a very unusual move for the company, which tends to be proud of its refusal to show off prototypes, refusal to pre-announce features. Apple pre-announced a feature and then couldn't actually finish it. There was a whole swath of features that were supposed to let you ask Siri to plan routes to that restaurant that was mentioned in the last message, or text my mum to tell her about my meeting I've got coming up. And Siri simply couldn't do that. It still can't. A year on, a whole iOS release later, Apple's failed to meet that. Yesterday's keynote didn't suggest much changes, actually. Apple is still holding to its proposal that it will ship those features before the end of this year, but it hasn't announced a time frame for that. It doesn't look like they'll be coming in iOS 26, because one of the minor changes is we're getting annual numbering rather than simply incremental counts. But yeah, they are still lagging behind companies like Google, that's incorporated its top-of-the-line Gemini chatbot into its Pixel phones, let alone the pure-play AI labs like Anthropic and OpenAI.
And can it catch up?
In-house, probably not. Never say never, and this is an enormously well-resourced company. But Apple's play has never been pure tech. It's always been about taking stuff that is at or near commodity and refining it, perfecting it, productizing it. That was clearly what their plan was for AI as well, to allow the OpenAIs of the world to race ahead in foundation models and to build a better set of products around commodity AI models. The problem seems to be that, well, firstly, the AI industry is moving so fast every day that if you're lagging behind the frontier, you are really noticeably behind that frontier. And secondly, that the nature of cutting edge AI today is it's very un-Apple. These systems, even when you use them from OpenAI, they break in weird ways. They don't do what you expect. It's very hard to polish them into that perfectly shiny sheen that Apple likes to present its products as. And it doesn't really know what to do with this, with a technology that is extremely powerful and useful 95% of the time and embarrassing 5%.
Consumers often talk about how devoted they are to their particular products. Are they now turning away from Apple?
This is the big, hope behind Apple and the reason to be confident that nothing is going to collapse anytime soon. Users are sticky. They are extremely sticky. They are, particularly in the US, where Apple has around a 50% market share of smartphones in general and a much higher market share of the premium end of the category. They're not going. They just aren't. They are buying new iPhones maybe every other year rather than every year. This is what the actual slow motion collapse of Apple will look like. It will be less frequent updates, but they're not switching away in any large numbers. Instead, the fear is that Apple will lose its footing in future product categories, that if an increasing chunk of what you do on your iPhone is just open the ChatGPT app and then work from there, that you're not going to care so much in 3 or 4 years' time about where your next phone comes from because your phone is just the platform for that app. In the really long-term future, Apple is clearly terrified about the prospect of AI native hardware of the sort that smaller companies like Rabbit AI have already released, that OpenAI is working on with Johnny Ive, former Apple chief product designer. A world where you may still have a phone, right? But where your most expensive, most valued piece of consumer technology is a headset, fancy headphones, and maybe even just a badge on your lapel, right? That is connected to an AI chatbot and, like the film Her, lives with you all the time. That's a world where Apple just stops being important and gets commodified away.
And what does all of this mean for Apple internally, and particularly the boss, Tim Cook?
It's hard to say. Tim Cook lives in the shadow of Steve Jobs, right? As any Apple chief executive for the next century will. But the man has left his mark on that company. He was, under Steve Jobs, he was the logistics guy. And it's boring, but hammering away at things like the amount of inventory Apple has warehoused, the number of days between a phone rolling off the product line in China and arriving on store shelves in California, the actually concentration of Apple product construction in a few companies so that Apple didn't need to have, this massive wide spread of suppliers. Those are all things that have really contributed to the company becoming and remaining as profitable as it is. But they might not be the skills that Apple needs to succeed over the next decade. Tim Cook made Apple utterly reliant on China. And at least for the next 4 years, that's going to be incredibly difficult to untangle. The company won't be able to untangle it before the end of Donald Trump's tenure, unless something really surprising happens, which means that it now faces this decision of, does it try to untangle it? How far does it go? Does it set itself a new course that might be irrelevant if things return to normalcy in America in the future? It would be very expensive to do either of those options. And Tim Cook, being a logistics guy, is not a visionary product person. Apple has launched successful lines under Tim Cook, right? AirPods are a rounding error in Apple's own revenue, but for any other company, they would be the most profitable thing they make. The Apple Watch has done very well. All of these things, in a very Apple way, were launched to size, shoulder shrugs, and have grown into behemoths in their own right. The Vision Pro, Cook's latest big product launch, hasn't gone quite so well. But who knows? Maybe if that large mixed reality headset can shrink and its price tag can significantly shrink from the $2,500 it's sold at right now, it could be a future product. But AI seems different from these shiny hardware things that Apple and Cook have succeeded in. And it may be that succeeding there requires a different sort of person at the top.
And what's your prediction? Will that happen?
I don't think Cook's going unless Cook wants to go. But he's had a long run of success. One of the big questions on the horizon is what happens in the fallout from this lawsuit with Epic, because it's not just that Apple was slapped with this punitive injunction preventing it from controlling comms with developers. It also had some members of staff referred for criminal contempt. The judge was really, really pissed off at how Apple had described its own internal communications somewhat differently from what they then turned out to be in the discovery process. Cook is involved in those communications. And I think if there is a single action that could imperil him, it would be, a conversation that he was CC'd in and engaged in, resulting in one of his lieutenants facing criminal charges. That would be a big deal. We're not there yet, but, I would be more concerned if I were Tim Cook than I have been any time in the last 15 years.
Alex, thank you so much for talking to me.
Thanks for having me.